For some reason, unbeknownst to all of us, our boy Phil Collins got some undue hate during the 80s and the 90s. But if you're not being criticized, then you're probably not doing anything worth noticing. Phil addressed a lot of the hate in his book, Not Dead Yet, and I'm happy to report that nowadays, Phil is looked upon as nostalgic. He's respected for what he deserves to be respected for. And there seems to be a lot more love for Phil these days. But I still think it's important that we debunk some of the dumb reasons that people gave Phil some shit. There's 5 reasons people hated Phil Collins. We're going to debunk them and set the record straight. But more importantly, I'm going to tell you the real reason why people hated Phil Collins. And it's none of these first 5 reasons we list. But there's a real reason why people hated Phil Collins. Let's discuss. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Everything Phil Collins. My name is Scott. Just a little caveat for people who like to comment in videos without watching, and you're probably not watching this, but a lot of people are going to come to Phil's defense right away. Of course, you know I'm already at Phil's defense, but we're going to look at some of these dumb reasons and explain why they are dumb and why people have no business hating Phil Collins back then or now. And some of you might say, well, who cares what people think? Well, Phil did. Phil really cared what people think. And this whole channel is about being an evangelist for Phil, not just his music, but for the great guy that he is. Also want to say thanks to our patrons who helped provide some input into this. Check the link below if you want to become a patron, and you get to get advance notice on what the episodes are about, and you can kind of give your feedback before I film. Okay, reason number 1. The divorce by fax, or as Phil refers to it, Faxgate. We're going to start with the dumbest first and go down to stuff that maybe is a little bit more somewhat relevant. So I'm going to burn through this one super quick because I also think it's kind of beneath this channel. I don't really like talking about his marriages or his personal life. He goes into it quite a lot in his book, but I guess at some point in the But Seriously era, when he was married to Jill, I think he already has a relationship with his soon-to-be third wife. He's working on both sides. Maybe he had released both sides. I can't remember. I think he actually had released both sides. I guess there's this moment in 94 when Phil knows that his marriage is falling apart and he wants to kind of convey his emotions to Jill and all of his feelings in a letter. And of course, like sending a letter would have taken a while and it was hard to reach people on phones. And maybe he just thought a letter would be better. And so he decides to fax it to her. Remember, he's super rich and fax is a new technology. And so he faxes her from his dressing room, which is something so funny to talk about now because like fax is so tied to the 90s, you know. But what's so stupid is that the idea that the British press would blow this up because like a fax was just a modern form of technology. I mean, today, if we were to dump someone via email, that's harsh, but it wouldn't be uncommon. But if we were to dump someone via email in the late 90s or early 2000s, it would make the news because not everybody used email. I think it was just a funny story. And the British press really loved to kind of blow up their own celebrities. As one of our patrons, John, mentioned, the British press just love to kind of attack their own. They still do it today. And Phil was just over that height. If the British press were to attack him in the No Jacket era or slightly before it, he would have been seen as a little too lovable, too much of an underdog, but now he's kind of over the popularity, like on the descent of But Seriously and both sides. So it's a great prime time to kind of attack him. Anyway, apparently the press get a hold of this fax and it just makes for good fodder. It's just a great way to blow up a celebrity. And us public, we like when our celebrities fall because it makes us feel better about ourselves. Anyway, that's all I want to talk about the subject. It's a stupid thing. Honestly, I don't think it really came over into America as much. I think it was more of like a British tabloid thing. It also had nothing to do with his music, which is why it's stupid. Okay, let's talk about Live Aid. Live Aid is talked about a lot in his book. And so this is a second reason that people bring up this issue for 2 things. First of all, this Led Zeppelin reunion, which Phil refers to as Robert Plant asking Phil to get him onto Bob Geldof's show, which they didn't know the name of at the time, which would become Live Aid. And Plant suggests that they do something with Jimmy and with Phil. There's no words of Led Zeppelin, although Phil is a huge Led Zeppelin fan. I think he stayed in communication with Bonham's son. Is that true? Anyway, by the time this all goes down, it's blown up in the press again as a Led Zeppelin reunion. So any type of performance that happens, which I believe it doesn't really happen without any type of rehearsal at all. There may have been alcohol involved. It just doesn't go over well. And I think Phil takes the blame, right? Because Phil's not a band member. The other thing is this showing off of the Concorde. And this has become a little bit more notorious. Now, I don't know if Phil kind of views his history with a little rose-colored bias. That might be true, but going by the book, and maybe Sting has different words, maybe Robert Plant has different parts of the story, but just a little note about Robert Plant. There was a recent article in NME about Plant saying how Phil was a driving force behind his solo career. And Robert Plant and Alison Krauss had a record that came out, I think it was called Rising Sand, a decade ago or more, and it won Album of the Year at the Grammys. I always kind of use that album as an example of like what I think Phil could do today, especially if you paired up with like Pharrell or Daft Punk or Adele and did some sort of like kind of almost like Ray Charles record that also won a Grammy. But anyway, I think like if he did something like super serious and meaningful, I feel like he could win a Grammy just based on like the love for legacy artists. Anyway, that was just a little caveat. Anyway, back to Live Aid. So basically, Sting asked Phil, Robert Plant asked Phil, according to Phil, maybe Phil begged them, but from what we know, Sting said, would you play with me? Robert Plant said, could you play with us? He's kind of committing to all these people. And then all of a sudden he realizes, oh, and Eric Clapton, of course, as well. So all of a sudden he realizes that like some people are playing in Philadelphia and some people are playing at Wembley. Then, of course, his manager, who thinks this could be good press, decides you could technically concord it with the time zones. And Phil said, yeah, I get to play with all my friends. I think this speaks to another one of the reasons why people hate Phil Collins, about the ubiquity, which we'll get to in a minute. But I think looking back in hindsight, I think Phil, I mean, the kind of person he became in the late 2000s and beyond, just a little bit more reserved, a little bit more like personal, set back a little bit. I think he probably regrets, being everywhere at once. But it was, who cares? It was for charity. Like, who cares he got on a plane and played a bunch of gigs? Who cares? The other thing, too, which is so funny, when we talk about Live Aid and we talk about Divorced by Fax, you look at the celebrities we have today and you look at like what it takes to get canceled today. And so like Phil got canceled by splitting up with his wife via an emerging technology. Today, to get canceled, you have to be racist, homophobic, a flat earther, murder someone, be charged with domestic abuse. But back then, you could get canceled by using a fax machine or using the Concorde jet to play a couple gigs in one day. Stupid. That was a different time, right? Number 3 is the ballads. And this is interesting because if you know, and see, here's the thing. Passive fans of Phil Collins, passive fans of pop music don't understand why there were so many Phil Collins ballads. I mean, we know Phil Collins is a drummer. We know that he would have stayed in Brand X forever. We know that he would have continued playing prog music behind Peter Gabriel forever if it weren't for other people's decisions. We know that he prefers Motown. We know that he prefers instrumental music. So these ballads, where did they come from and how did they become synonymous with Phil? Well, a lot of like not diehard fans like us, they think of Phil associated with Groovy Kind of Love or Against All Odds. But let's look at some of these songs. The interesting thing is that the reason why Phil had so many ballads, whatever the reasons were, had nothing to do with his own desire and his own pursuits. You take Against All Odds, for an example, something he's mostly known for. That was a song from the Face Value era that he didn't even think was good enough to show the band. He didn't think it was good enough to put on Face Value. And he revisited it again for Hello, I Must Be Going. And he even thought, no, still not good enough. It wasn't until somebody said, we need a song for a movie soundtrack. And he said, okay, I've got this throwaway song. Let's shoehorn the title into it somehow. And then it blows up. Same thing with Groovy Kind of Love. Groovy Kind of Love was supposed to be a demo. It was just a 60s song for the movie. He said, this is how it should sound. Let's find someone to record it. The producers were like, you know what? You're better than anybody else. Let's just use your version. He was reluctant. Separate Lives, he didn't write. Somebody else asked him to sing and to make it a duet for a soundtrack. Okay. In Too Deep even was for a soundtrack, with the exception of maybe One More Night. And of course, some of the ballads from Face Value and Hello, I Must Be Going that didn't become pop hits. It wouldn't be until later into But Seriously where Phil would start to embrace the ballads like Do You Remember and later with Every Day. But in the early days, he didn't write ballads to be hits. In fact, most of his ballads were just throwaway songs. It was Motown songs, songs with horns, songs with great drums that he was more passionate about. So did Phil write too many ballads? Did he become known for too many ballads? I mean, the thing that you have to realize is that any artist does not control what people like. Phil did not get to pick his hit songs. He would have input as to what would be released as singles. His record label would ultimately decide that, but no artist can dictate what fans will respond to. Reason number 4 that people hate Phil Collins is for ruining Genesis. And I agree that Phil and Steve ruined Genesis. I don't think Genesis released anything good after From Genesis to Revelation. All that Bee Gees stuff was really, really great. But when Phil joined the band and when Steve joined the band, they became prog and artsy, and they released horrible songs like Watcher and Supper's Ready. I prefer everything before Trespass. Anything after From Genesis is horrible. I'm just joking. That's stupid. Is there anybody out there that feels that way? I would be curious. You win a CD if you do. I've done a whole video about why Phil Collins didn't ruin Genesis, and there's like 100 reasons why. So I'm not even going to get into that. Just click the link in my profile somewhere on this page, and you can watch that whole video. We know that Phil didn't ruin Genesis because the primary reason is that Genesis was a band of 3 towards the end. And during the era where people thought that Phil ruined Genesis, he didn't really have as much control as people assumed. Tony liked writing hits, Mike liked writing hits, and wrote a lot of great hits, even on his own. So just because some songs like In Too Deep or Invisible Touch maybe sounded like No Jacket Required, it didn't mean that it wasn't driven by the other 2 members in the band. I also talk in that video about how Phil saved Genesis, because when Peter left, they auditioned a bunch of people and they weren't happy with anyone. So that could have been the end of Genesis right there. Genesis could have shifted into an instrumental band that maybe would not have been as popular. Most likely wouldn't have been as popular. Anyway, watch that video. And reason number 5 is the ubiquity. And this speaks to the 80s and the 90s. He was producing so many people's records. He was appearing on people's records. So many songs just surprisingly became hits, like soundtrack songs and songs that were the start of side B on Philip Bailey's solo record, songs in Genesis and songs from his solo records. And then, of course, you had these massive tours with Genesis that would end and pass the baton to massive solo tours, which would then end and pass the baton to massive Genesis tours. And so normally, especially back in those days, you would have like a 2 to 3 year window where you didn't hear from a band for very long. Then they would advertise a new album, promote that album, tour that album, then they disappear for 3 to 5 years. That never happened with Phil in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because when No Jacket was done, Invisible Touch started, then Buster, then But Seriously, then We Can't Dance, then Both Sides. There really was no time for a break, which caused Phil his health and his marriages, but it's why he gets accused of being ubiquitous in an annoying way. I think Phil's best defense for this is that when you're given a great opportunity, bands like The Who or ABBA or Eric Clapton or Led Zeppelin, if these favorite bands of Phil asked him to do a project, produce a record, do a duet, he just had a hard time saying no. I mean, as much as I love my family, if Phil asked to do a duet with me or to produce his record, I'm right here. I'm ready. Well, I'd abandon my family here, fly over to wherever and do it. So I think Phil's biggest defense of his ubiquity was just how hard it was to say no to his icons who now wanted to work with him because he was the hot thing at the time. So we've just listed 5 reasons: Divorced by Fax, Live Aid, the pop ballads, ruining Genesis, and his musical and pop culture ubiquity. But none of those reasons are the true reasons. Those are just the rational excuses that people give because they can't put their finger on the irrational reason as to why people hated Phil Collins and still don't respect him in the way that I think he should be respected. Are you ready for it? Here's the real reason why people hated Phil Collins. Because he didn't fit the profile of a pop icon. He didn't fit the profile of a rock star. He did not conform to what people would expect someone who sold hundreds of millions of records for what a drummer should look like. He was talented, he was successful, he was popular, but he didn't conform. He didn't have tattoos. He didn't wear a leather jacket. He wasn't mysterious. He didn't bite the head off of a bird on stage. He barely swore in public. He was funny. He wasn't dark. I can't really comment on his sexual appeal, but he certainly wasn't George Michael or Sting, but he was as popular as Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. He had 2 successful careers happening at the same time. And he didn't look like the kind of artist who would be as big as he is. People to this day still can't understand why a guy who would stick his middle finger to the industry could be so successful. Today, if you were to try to make a male pop star, you would not sketch out the body and hairline of Phil Collins. You wouldn't want to find someone who's goofy on stage, who does silly dances. You wouldn't start with a drummer. Phil doesn't fit the mold of a rock star or a pop star and never has. And so all people can do is criticize him for stupid reasons that have no bearing because they just don't understand. I think if Phil walked out on stage with tattoos and piercings and cool clothes and didn't look at the audience and treated people like crap, trashed his hotel room, didn't try to speak the language of the audience, didn't make any jokes, no party tricks, just sang his songs and disappeared, he probably would have more respect in the press. But it's because he was an everyday guy. He'd wear a golf shirt, khaki pants. He wore glasses. He replaced the mysterious antics of Peter Gabriel with chatting with the audience, and being silly with the audience. He kind of tore down that fourth wall. This is what I think a lot of us love about Phil Collins, an everyday guy, a blue-collar worker who becomes a pop star. But I think it confused the heck out of most people in the press, most passive listeners of Phil Collins, most uppity critics. And this, I think, is the real reason why people hated Phil Collins, is they didn't understand how he could be a phenomenal drummer, how he could be phenomenally successful in every incarnation of Genesis, how every single song that he wrote was stunning, and how a lot of them went to the top of the charts. His drumming was self-taught. His vocals were self-taught. He was forced to become a frontman, and yet his voice is now iconic, and nobody sings like him. He became a songwriter accidentally and wrote some of the most iconic songs, from Against All Odds to You'll Be in My Heart. Now it's your turn. What did I miss? What other stupid reasons do people have to give Phil Collins a hard time? And do you agree with me? Do you think that these reasons are just a distraction? That these reasons are just something for people to put their fingers on, but the true reason is that they just couldn't figure out why a normal dude could write such amazing songs and sell so many records? If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for exclusive videos, behind-the-scenes content, and to have your say on future topics before I film. Have a look at our Patreon page. Thanks for watching.